My name is Isata Kabia from Sierra Leone. I am founding director of Voice of Women Africa, which aims to build a cadre of women who believe in themselves and in other women. We mentor young women and we train women who want to seek elected office. So we enable, encourage, and hopefully we're able to finance in some capacity to increase the number of women seeking elected office. Feminist foreign policy is one that takes into consideration especially vulnerable communities and has an approach of inclusivity. And even though there isn't a definitive definition, there are agreed components as to what should comprise a feminist policy. And I think Sweden was the pioneer that was brave enough not to be ridiculed, even though they were. And since then, a couple of countries have joined them, whether implicitly or explicitly. And I think also part of the problem is that the challenge is that when you have progressive agendas, there are elements that everybody wants to include, there are elements that everybody criticizes, but we do not have a single agreed definition. But I think after all these years, since 2014, when Sweden was brave enough, we have enough experiences now to know what it should be and what it shouldn't. And making sure women are at the center is definitely one of those elements, not just to be appointed, but to be part of the decision making, not to be tokens, but to have entrenched responsibility as well as power to be able to execute such a policy. Another element would be the gender responsive budgets, for example, that so many countries in their own piecemeal way have added over the years. But to make it a central duty that every government budget is actually geared towards feminist responsibilities, towards executing that feminist policy. Also, we have gender desks in certain countries now, but we haven't holistically adopted and implemented resolutions that are so old. And imagine the Beijing Declaration, which will be 25, and UN Resolution 1325, which turns 20. And yet still, 20 years later, we have countries whom might I say are resistant, actually doing what is right. And I see a feminist policy as doing what is right by your nationals as a country, but also in your interactions with other countries. At this point in 2021, I believe even having the language a feminist foreign policy is in itself progress. And I believe that language matters. So we get to the point where we can actually implement these ideas and turn them into policy and turn them into law, whether it's national law for single countries or, hopefully international bodies, multilateral bodies, regional bodies such as the AU or the UN and others, where they would actually be able to accept these elements and compose them into a singular policy that would be widely acceptable by all countries. And whereas we can have, gender responsive budgets, or we can have gender desks, we can also have quotas for the corrective action, for example, for many gender areas. And in Sierra Leone, for example, we are still fighting for a 30% quota for women's representation. And we've had a draft policy on this since 2013. And then we've had 2 or 3 different versions of that, attempting to turn it into a law between 2013 and now, and it still hasn't happened. And when you talk to those in power or those closely related to ensuring that becomes a law, whether it's parliamentarians, whether it's government, the executive, and whether it's those closely related to politics in general, the language really dictates what can and cannot happen. And I believe that where we are right now, culture in Sierra Leone is so entrenched in people's minds that there are some laws that are progressive for gender, which have not been able to be holistically implemented, executed, because the culture is the barrier. So if we are to make progress in certain areas like budgets or like quotas, I do believe that centralizing this and making sure that it is a government policy, a government agreement would be a better way to go than having these piecemeal elements. So quotas are difficult still for some countries to accept, and men in particular very resistant, because you realize you're going to somehow eliminate a man because they're the ones mostly sitting in these chairs. These are not new positions you're creating, these are not new areas, but somehow you're going to eliminate a man by having a quota, so they are resistant to that. But if governments are to take these on and create these policies at the central level, then I believe it will be much easier for us to make the gains necessary. Oh, good question. I think both. And it's the chicken and egg issue. But definitely I think both. And the good thing is that there is no single country now working in isolation. There's nobody working in a vacuum. So whereas Sweden has been bold enough to declare feminist foreign policy, and therefore their interactions with countries such as ours and others would then reflect their stance on these issues. It forces countries who then want to deal with Sweden, for example, to be able to adopt similar policies. So in some areas, the policy would dictate the change, and in others, the change in other countries then would dictate the evolving policies. I think the most important aspect of that would be the respect to sovereignty, while recognizing the fact that there is no island. So Sierra Leone might deal with its own interactions internationally through its own sovereignty, but those dealings will rub off on Sierra Leone, for example, but there is no way to what they should and should not do in terms of a feminist foreign policy. There is a way to advise based on those good interactions, based on the resultant interactions. They should be able then to take on these new elements, incorporate them, and evolve. And I think that evolution for countries should be natural, should be unforced. Otherwise, we do tend to lose gains we make, and invariably we end up in worse off situations. So I believe just by exposure to these policies and the fact that they do work for countries that have adopted them, and how they work for countries that have adopted them, and learning from that, I think, is a great way to showcase what is good about the evolution, what is good about these progressive policies, without dictating. And the decolonization, especially when we define it as such for countries within Africa, for example, would be one that would be more beneficial for progress and movement towards a feminist foreign policy than the imposition, which many countries have complained about so many times, where those of us working on the ground to accelerate gender movements in countries are usually accused of bringing foreign culture and are usually sidelined, or their attempts to marginalize our thought and entrench existing culture. So it's important to find a way to work with countries in a way that, you know, it feels like a natural evolution based on exposure, experience, and interaction with these new policies. Yes, I think definitely there's room for transformation. And I think the very idea of security in its male costume right now is in itself not, it does not support security at all. So what am I trying to say? So at the moment, the way we view security as rejection or protection or elimination, rejection or elimination of certain elements in society, as opposed to protection and inclusion, in itself has to evolve and transform. And I believe security as it is now, with the women's peace and security initiatives that are coming up, I think that will inform a new kind of security policy at national and multinational level. And the evolution of peacekeeping forces, we're talking about physical security, national security, international security, would also be a way to transform current ways that countries or multinationals have been approaching security sector. But I believe if women, who tend to suffer most, are most affected when there is a lapse in security, if they are at the center of the security policies, whatever that transformation may look like, I think we would then get to a place where the security sector, the peacekeeping sector, and peace building sector would serve humanity as opposed to serving power. There's no easy way, and there is no single magic bullet. So from India to Ethiopia to Sierra Leone to Sweden, the differences are numerous, and the differences are clear. Those differences impact who we are on a daily basis and who we've become as nations. And the sovereignty that people usually speak to and yet people usually fight for is not really about protecting Indians or Sierra Leoneans or Swedes. The sovereignty they speak to, again, is about protecting their own power in government. And that sovereignty usually comes out as a shtick when there is a law that would suggest change in a way that would result in a loss for them or to them personally. And if we take, for example, the resolution, UN, Resolution 1325, or AU laws that we have tried to craft at the Pan-African Parliament, or the EU as a parliament, for example, which has evolved to assist and support a bloc of countries. And you see how people accept or reject these laws and policies piecemeal based on how they serve them individually. So where there is a gain for nationals, there's always an immediate loss before you see the resulting gain. And people resist that because somehow there will be a change to what they believe to be their inherent rights or their inherent cultures as nationals, as sovereigns. But if we are to work in a way that we're able to show the example. We've shown the examples now with the UN as a body that recommends and then tries to support countries to implement and execute. And I think sovereignty at that stage matters, of course, but sovereignty does not dictate how countries deal with UN resolutions when the impact to them is more positive. And when we're trying to change systems, if we're talking about systems thinking, when we're trying to change systems, it's not easy, and we are going to have a difficult time. But the 20 years and the 25 years and other resolutions and those examples that we've had, and how countries have evolved positively based on that, I think is the example that we use to overcome the sovereign argument. At the same time, as we talk about decolonization of these introduction of these policies, I think we have to keep in mind the aspect of countries already have some national laws that may be in conflict with the ones we are trying to introduce. And in order for us to be able to change that, you have to first recognize what exists. You have to respect how we got there, and then recommend how we move to the next step.